Chapter 16. White girl, Ritimi's 6-year-old son shouted, running along the manioc rows. Out of breath, he stopped in front of me, then cried out excitedly, "White girl, your brother." "My what?" Dropping my digging stick, I ran toward the Shabono. I stopped at the edge of the cleared strip of forest, around the wooden palisade, circling the Shabono. Although it was not considered a garden, gourds, cotton, and an assortment of medicinal plants grew there. According to Etuwa, the reason for this cleared strip was that enemies could not possibly trespass silently through this kind of vegetation, as they could a forest cover. No unusual sounds came from the huts. Crossing the clearing toward the group of people squatting outside Arasue's hut, I was not surprised to see Milagros. "Blonde Indian," he said in Spanish, motioning me to squat beside him. "You even smell like one." "I'm glad you are here," I said. "Little Sisiwe said you were my brother." "I spoke to Father Coriolano at the mission." Milagros pointed to the writing pads, pencils, sardine cans, boxes of crackers, and sweet biscuits the Itikoteri were passing around. "Father Coriolano wants me to take you back to the mission," Milagros said, looking at me thoughtfully. I could think of nothing to say. Picking up a twig, I drew lines on the dirt. "I can't leave yet." "I know." Milagros smiled, but there was a trace of sadness about his lips. His voice was quite gentle, ironic. "I told Father Coriolano you were doing much work. I convinced him how important it is for you to finish this remarkable research you are conducting." I could not repress my giggles. He sounded like a pompous anthropologist. "Did he believe you?" Milagros pushed the writing pads and pencils toward me. "I assured Father Coriolano that you are well." From a small bundle, Milagros pulled out a box containing 3 bars of Kamei soap. "He also gave me these for you." "What am I to do with them?" I asked, sniffing the scented bars. "Wash yourself," Milagros said emphatically, as if he really believed I had forgotten what soap was for. "Let me smell it," Ritimi said, lifting a bar from the box. She held it against her nose, closed her eyes, and took one long breath. What are you going to wash with it?" "My hair," I exclaimed. It occurred to me that perhaps the soap would kill the lice. "I'll wash mine too," Ritimi said, rubbing the bar on her head. "Soap only works with water," I explained. "We have to go to the river." "To the river!" cried the woman who had gathered around the men as they stood up. Laughing, we ran down the path. Men returning from the gardens just gaped at us, whereas the women accompanying them turned around and ran after us, toward Ritimi, who was holding the precious soap in her upraised hand. "You have to get your hair wet," I called out from the water. The women remained on the bank, looking doubtfully at me. Grinning, Ritimi handed me the soap. Soon my head was covered with a thick lather. I scrubbed hard, enjoying the dirty suds squishing through my fingers, down my neck, back, and chest. With a halved calabash, I rinsed my hair, using the soapy water to wash my body. I began to sing an old Spanish commercial advertising Kamei soap, one I used to hear on the radio as a child. "For a heavenly array, there is nothing like Jabon Kamei." "Who wants to be next?" I asked, wadding toward the bank where the women stood. I felt I was glowing with cleanliness. Stepping back, the women smiled, but none volunteered. I will, I will, little Teshoma shouted, running into the water. One by one, the women came closer. Awed, they watched attentively as the suds seemed to grow out of the child's head. I worked up a stiff lather and shaped Teshoma's hair until spikes stuck out all around her head. Hesitantly, Rotimi touched her daughter's hair. A timid smile wrinkled the corners of her mouth. Woohoo! What a beauty! Keep your eyes closed until I've rinsed out all the soap, I admonished Teshoma. Close them tight. It hurts if the suds run into your eyes. For a heavenly array, Teshoma cried out as the soapy water ran down her back. There is nothing like. She looked at me, and I filled in the rest. Sing that song again. I want my hair to turn the color of yours. It won't turn my color, I said, but it will smell good. I want to be next. The women began shouting. Except for the pregnant ones who were afraid that the magic soap might harm their unborn child, I washed at least 25 heads. However, not wanting to be outdone, the pregnant women decided to wash their hair in the accustomed manner, with leaves and mud from the bottom of the river. To them, too, I had to sing the silly Kame soap commercial. By the time we were all scrubbed, my voice was hoarse. The men gathered around Arasue's hut. The men gathered around Arasue's hut were still listening to Milagros' account of his visit to the outside world. They sniffed our hair as we squatted beside them. An old woman crouching next to a youth pushed his head between her legs. Sniff this. I washed it with Kame soap. She began to hum the melody of the commercial. The men and women burst into guffaws. Still laughing, Ituwa shouted, Grandmother, no one wants your vagina, even if you fill it with honey. Cackling, the woman made an obscene gesture, then went inside her hut. Ituwa, she shouted from her hammock. I've seen you lying between the legs of even older hags than myself. After the laughter subsided, Milagros pointed to the 4 machetes placed on the ground in front of him. Your friends left these at the mission before departing for the city, he said. They are for you to give away. I looked at him helplessly. Why so few? Because I couldn't carry more, Milagros said cheerfully. Don't give them to the women. I will give them to the head man, I said, gazing at the expectant faces around me. Grinning, I pushed the 4 machetes in front of Arasue. My friends sent these for you. White girl, you are clever, he said, checking the sharp point of one of the machetes. This one I will keep for myself. One is for my brother, Iramamoe, who has protected you from the Mokototeri. One is for Hayama's son, from whose garden and game you eat the most. Arasue looked at Ituwa. One should be for you, but since you were given a machete not too long ago at one of our feasts, I will give the machete to your wives, Ritimi and Tutemi. They take care of the white girl as if she were their own sister. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then one of the men stood up and addressed Ritimi. Give me your machete so I can cut down trees. You don't need to do the work a man does. Don't give it to him, Tutimi said. It's easier to work in the gardens with a machete than with a digging stick. Ritimi looked at the machete, picked it up, then handed it to the man. I will give it to you. The worst sin of all is to not give away what others ask of you. I don't want to end up in Shoparariwabe. Where is that? I whispered to Milagros. Shopariwabe is a place like the missionaries' hell. I opened one of the sardine cans. After popping one of the silvery, oily fish into my mouth, I offered the can to Ritimi. Try one, I coaxed her. She looked at me uncertainly. Between thumb and forefinger, she daintily lifted a piece of sardine into her mouth. Ugh, what an ugly taste, she cried, spitting it out. Milagros took the can from my hand. Save them. They are for the journey back to the mission. But I'm not going back yet, I said. They will spoil if we save them for long. You should return before the rains, Milagros said gravely. Once they start, it will be impossible to cross rivers or walk through the forest. I could not help the smug grin. I have to stay at least until Tutemi's child is born, I said. I was sure the baby would arrive during the rains. What shall I tell Father Coriolano? What you told him already, I said mockingly, that I'm doing remarkable work. But he expects you to return before the rains, Milagros said. It rains for months. Smiling, I took one of the boxes of crackers. We better eat these. They will spoil with the humidity. Don't open the other sardine cans, Milagros said in Spanish. The Iticoteri won't like them. I will eat them myself. Aren't you afraid to go to Shaporariwabe? Without answering, Milagros passed the already opened can around. Most of the men only smelled the contents, then handed it to the next person. The ones who were daring enough to taste the sardines spit them out. The women did not bother either smelling or trying them. Milagros smiled at me when the can was returned to him. They don't like sardines. I will not go to hell if I eat them all by myself. The crackers were no success either, except with the few children who licked off the salt. But the sweet biscuits, even though they tasted rancid, were eaten with smacking sounds of approval. Ritimi appropriated the writing pads and pencils. She insisted I teach her the same kind of designs with which I had decorated my burned notebook. Dutifully, she practiced writing the Spanish and English words I had taught her. She was not interested in learning how to write, even though she eventually learned to draw all the letters of the alphabet, including a few Chinese ideograms I had once been taught in calligraphy class. To Ritimi, they remained designs that she painted sometimes on her body, preferring the letters S and W. Milagros stayed for a few weeks at the Shabono. He went hunting with the men and helped them in the gardens. Most of the time, however, he spent lounging in his hammock, doing nothing but play with the children. At all hours, one could hear the shrieks of delight as Milagros balanced the younger ones high in the air on his upraised feet. In the evenings, he entertained us with stories about the Nape, the white men he had met through the years, the places he had visited, and the eccentric customs he had observed. Nape was a term applied to all foreigners, that is, all who were not Yanomama. The Iticoteri made no distinction between nationalities. To them, a Venezuelan, Brazilian, Swede, German, or American, regardless of their color, were Nape. Seen through Milagros' eyes, these white men appeared peculiar, even to me. It was his sense of humor, his knack for the absurd, and his dramatic rendition that transformed the most mundane, insignificant event into an extraordinary happening. If ever anyone in the audience dared to doubt the veracity of his account, Milagros, in a very dignified manner, would turn to me. "White girl, tell them if I'm lying." No matter how much he had exaggerated, I never contradicted him. Chapter 17. Tutemi joined Rotimi and me in the gardens. "I think my time is coming," she said, dropping her wood-filled basket on the ground. "My arms have no strength. My breathing is not deep. I can no longer bend easily." "Are you in pain?" I asked, seeing Tutemi's face twist into a grimace. She nodded. "I'm also afraid." Gently, Rotimi probed the girl's stomach, first on the sides, then the front. "The baby is kicking hard. It's time for it to come out." Rotimi turned to me. "Go get old Hayama. Tell her that Tutemi is in pain. She will know what to do." "Where will you be?" Rotimi pointed straight ahead. I cut through the forest, jumping over fallen trunks, heedless of thorns, roots, and stones. "Come quickly," I shouted, gasping for air. In front of Hayama's hut. "Tutemi is having her child. She's in pain." Picking up her bamboo knife, Rotimi's grandmother first went to see an old man living in a hut across the clearing. "I'm sure you heard the white girl," Hayama said. Seeing the old man nod, she added, "If we need you, I will send her to get you." I walked in front of Hayama, impatiently waiting every 50 paces for her to catch up. Leaning heavily on the piece of broken bow she used as a cane, she seemed to be moving even more slowly than usual. "Is the old man a Shapori?" I asked. "He knows all there is to know about a child that does not want to be born. Tutemi has only pains." "When there is pain," Hayomi said deliberately, "it means that the child doesn't want to leave the womb." "I don't think it means that at all." I was unable to disguise the argumentative tone of my voice. "It's normal for the first child to be difficult," I affirmed, as if I really knew. "White women have pains with almost every child." "It's not normal," Hayama affirmed. "Maybe white babies don't want to see the world." Tutemi's moans came muffled through the underbrush. She was crouching on the platanilo. Leaves Rotimi had spread on the ground. Dark shadows circled her feverish eyes. Minute drops of perspiration shone above her brow and on her upper lip. "The water has already broken," Rotimi said, "but the baby doesn't want to come." "Let us go further into the forest," Tutemi begged. "I don't want anyone at the Shabono to hear my screams." Tenderly, old Hayama pushed the young woman's bangs back from her forehead and wiped the sweat from her face and neck. "It will be better in a moment," she said soothingly, as if speaking to a child. Each time the contractions came, Hayama pressed hard on Tutemi's stomach. After what I judged to be an interminably long time, Hayama told me to get the old Shapori. He was prepared. He had taken a pina, and over the fire a dark concoction was boiling. With a stick he flicked the mucus from his nose, then poured the brew into a gourd. "What is it made of?" "Roots and leaves," he said, but did not mention the name of the plant. As soon as we reached the three women, he urged Tutemi to empty the gourd to the last drop. While she drank, he danced around her. In a high nasal voice, He pleaded with the hikura of the white monkey to release the neck of the unborn child. Slowly, Tutami's face relaxed, and her eyes lost their frightened expression. "I think the baby will come now," she said, smiling at the old man. Hayama held her from behind, stretching Tutami's arms over her head. While I was wondering whether it was the concoction or the shaman's dance that had induced such a state of relaxation, I missed the actual birth. I put my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream as I saw the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck of the purple-skinned boy. Hayama cut the cord, then put a leaf on the navel to absorb the blood. She rubbed her forefinger in the afterbirth, then smeared the finger against the child's lips. "What is she doing?" I asked Ritimi. "She is making sure the boy will learn to speak properly." Before I had a chance to blurt out that the child was dead, the most disconcerting human cry I have ever heard echoed through the forest. Ritimi picked up the screaming infant and motioned me to follow her to the river. She filled her mouth with water, waited for a moment for it to warm up, then squirted it over the baby. Imitating her, I helped her rinse his little body clean of slime and blood. "Now he has 3 mothers," Ritimi said, handing the baby to me. "Whoever washes the newborn baby is responsible for it, should something happen to the mother. Tutami will be happy that you have helped wash her child." Ritimi filled a large platanilo leaf with mud, while I cradled the boy in uncertain terms. I had never held a newborn baby before. Looking in awe at the purplish, wrinkled face, at his tiny fists, which he tried to push into his mouth, I wondered what miracle had made him live. Hayama wrapped the placenta into a tight bundle of leaves and placed it under a small elevated windscreen the old man had built under a tall ceiba. It was to be burned in a few weeks. With the mud, we covered all traces of blood on the ground to prevent wild animals and dogs from sniffing around. With the child safely in her arms, Tutami led the way back to the Shabono. Before entering her hut, she placed him on the ground. We, who had witnessed the birth, had to step 3 times over the baby, thus marking his acceptance into the settlement. Itua did not look up from his hammock. He had been resting there since learning that his youngest wife was in labor. Tutami entered the hut with their newborn son and sat by the hearth. After squeezing her nipple, she pushed it inside the baby's mouth. Avidly, the boy began to suck, opening his still unfocused eyes from time to time, as if imprinting on his mind this source of food and comfort. Neither parent ate anything that day. On the 2nd and 3rd day, Itua caught a basket full of small fish, which he cooked and fed to Tutami. Thereafter, both of them slowly resumed a normal diet. The day after giving birth, Tutami returned to work in the gardens with the newborn baby strapped on her back. Itua, on the other hand, remained resting in his hammock for a week. Any physical effort on his part was believed to be deleterious to the infant's health. On the 9th day, Milagros was asked to pierce the boy's earlobes with long rasha palm thorns, which were kept in the holes. After cutting the sharp points close to the lobes, Milagros coated each end with resin so the child would not pull the blunted thorns out. On that same day, the infant was also given the name of Hoashiwe, for it was a white monkey that had wanted to keep the child in the womb. It was only a nickname. By the time the boy started walking, he would be given his real name. Chapter 18. It was not quite dawn when Milagros leaned over my hammock. I felt his calloused hand brushing my forehead and cheeks. I could hardly see his features in the darkness. I knew he was leaving. I waited for him to speak, but fell asleep without finding out whether he had actually wanted to say something. The rains will come soon, old Kamosiwe announced that evening. I've seen the size of the young turtles. I've been listening to the croaking of the rain frogs. 4 days later, in the early afternoon, the wind blew with terrifying force through the trees and the Shabono. The empty hammocks swung back and forth like boats on a tempestuous sea. The leaves on the ground swirled in spiraling dances that died as suddenly as they had begun. I stood in the middle of the clearing, watching the gusts of wind coming from every direction. Pieces of bark flattened against my shins. Kicking my legs, I tried to shake the bark off, but it stuck to me as if it had been glued on. Giant black clouds darkened the sky. The steady, far-off roar of approaching rain grew louder as it moved across the forest. Thunder rumbled through the clouds, and the flickering of white lightning flashed through the afternoon darkness. The groans of a falling tree, hit by lightning, echoed through the forest with the mournful clamor of other uprooted trees crashing to the ground. Shrieking, the women and children huddled together behind the plantains stacked against the sloping roof. Seizing a log from the fire, old Hayama rushed into Iramamoe's hut. Desperately, she began to beat one of the poles. "Wake up!" she screamed. "Your father is not here. Wake up! Defend us from the Hekuras." Hayama was addressing Iramamoe's personal Hekura, for he was out hunting with several other men. Thunder and lightning receded into the distance as the clouds broke open above us. The rain came in a solid sheet, so dense we could not see across the clearing. Moments later, the sky was clear. I accompanied old Kamosiwe to look at the roaring river. Masses of earth toppled from the banks, gouged out by the raging torrent. Each landslide was followed by the tearing of vines, which snapped with the sound of breaking bowstrings. A great stillness settled over the forest. Not a bird, insect, or frog could be heard. Suddenly, without any warning, a growl of thunder seemed to come directly out of the sun, cracking over our heads. "But there are no clouds," I shouted, falling on the ground as if struck. "Don't defy the spirits," Kamosiwe warned me. Cutting 2 large leaves, he motioned me to take cover. Squatting side by side, we watched the rain cascade down from a clear sky. Gusts of wind shook the forest until the curtains of dark clouds hid the sun once more. Storms are caused by the dead whose bones have not been burned, whose ashes have not been eaten, old Kamasiwe said. It's these unfortunate spirits, longing to be cremated, who heat up the clouds until fires light up the sky. Fires that will finally burn them. I completed his sentence. Whew, you are not so ignorant anymore, Kamasiwe said. The rains have started. You will be with us for many days. You will learn so much more. Smiling, I nodded. Do you think Milagros has reached the mission? Kamasiwe looked at me askance, then broke into a hoarse, raspy laughter, the laughter of a very old man, resounding eerily in the noise of the rain. He still had most of his teeth. Strong and yellowish, they stood out from his receding gums like pieces of aged ivory. Milagros did not go to the mission. He went to see his wife and children. At which settlement does Milagros live? In many. Does he have a wife and children in all of them? Milagros is a talented man, Kamasiwe said, his one dark eye shining with a devilish glint. He has a white woman somewhere. Filled with anticipation, I looked at Kamasiwe. I was finally going to learn something about Milagros. But the old man remained silent. When he put his hand in mine, I knew his mind had wandered elsewhere. Slowly, I massaged his gnarled fingers. Old man, are you really Milagros' grandfather? I asked, hoping to bring him back to the subject of Milagros. Startled, Kamasiwe looked into my face, his one eye scrutinizing me intently, as if he had thought of something. Mumbling, he gave me his other hand to massage. Absent-mindedly, I watched his one eye rolling into his socket as he drowsed. I wonder how old you really are. Kamasiwe's eye came to rest on my face, clouded with memories. If you lay out the time I've lived, it would reach all the way to the moon, Kamasiwe murmured. That's how old I am. We stayed under the leaves, watching the dark clouds disperse across the sky. Mist drifted through the trees, filtering the light to a ghostly gray. The rains have started, Kamasiwe repeated softly as we walked back to the Shabono. The fires in the huts produced more smoke than heat, but the rainy air created a misty warmth. I stretched in my hammock and fell asleep to the distant and confused sounds of the storming forest. The morning was cold and damp. Ritimi, Tutemi, and I stayed in our hammocks the whole day, eating baked plantains and listening to the rain pound on the palm-thatched roofs. I wish Itua and the others had returned last night from the hunt, Ritimi mumbled from time to time, looking at the sky, which changed only from a faint white to gray. The hunters returned late in the afternoon of the following day. Iramamoe and Itua walked directly in to old Hayama's hut, carrying her youngest son, Matue, in a leader made from bark strips. Matue had been injured by a falling branch. Carefully, the two men transferred him to his own hammock. His leg hung limply down, and his shin bone threatened to pierce the swollen purple skin. It's broken, old Hayama said. It's broken, I repeated with the rest of the women in the hut. I had adopted the habit of stating the obvious. It was a way of expressing concern, love, sympathy, all at once. Matue gasped in pain as Hayama set the leg straight. Ritimi held his foot outstretched while the old woman made a splint with broken pieces of arrow shafts. Deftly, she arranged them along each side of the leg, inserting cotton fibers in between the skin and cane. Around the splint, extending all the way from the ankle to the middle of his thigh, Hayama bound fresh strips of a thin, resistant bark. Totemi and Shotomi, the man's young wife, giggled each time Matue moaned. They were not amused, but were trying to cheer him up. Oh, Matue, it doesn't hurt, Shotomi tried to convince him. Remember how glad you were when your head was bleeding after you had been hit with a club at the last feast? Stay still, Hayama said to her son. Fastening a liana rope over one of the rafters, she tied one end to his ankle, the other to his thigh. Now you cannot move your leg, she said, inspecting her work with satisfaction. About 2 weeks later, Hayama removed the bark and cane splint. The purple bruised leg had turned green and yellowish, but was no longer swollen. She probed around the bone lightly. It's growing together, she announced, then proceeded to massage the leg with warm water. Every day for almost a month, she went through the same routine of unfastening the cast, massaging the leg, then tying it back to the rafter. The bone is mended, Hayama affirmed one day, breaking the cane splint into small pieces. But my leg is not healed, Matue protested in alarm. I cannot move it properly. Hayama calmed him, explaining that his knee had become stiff from having had his leg stretched out for so long. I'll continue massaging your leg until you can walk as you did before. The rains brought with them a sense of tranquility, of timelessness, as day and night blurred into each other. No one worked much in the gardens. For endless hours, we lay or sat in our hammocks conversing in that odd way people do when it rains, with long pauses and absent-minded stares into the distance. Ritimi tried to make a basket weaver out of me. I started out with what I thought was the easiest kind, the large U-shaped basket used for carrying wood. The women had great fun watching my awkward attempts at trying to master the simple twining technique. I then concentrated my efforts on something I believed to be more manageable: the flat, disc-like baskets used for storing fruit or separating the ashes from the bones of the dead. Although I was quite pleased with the finished product, I had to agree with old Hayama that the basket did not look the way it was supposed to. Grinning at her, I remembered the time a school friend had done her best to teach me how to knit. In the most relaxed manner, while watching TV, talking, or waiting for an appointment, she knitted beautiful sweaters, mittens, and skiing caps. I sat tensely beside her, with tight shoulders, my stiff fingers holding the needles only inches away from my face, cursing every time I dropped a stitch. I was not ready to give up basketry. One had to try at least 3 times I told myself, as I began to make one of the flat fishing baskets. Woohoo, white girl, Shatomo giggled uncontrollably. You didn't twine it tight enough. She put her fingers through the loosely woven vine strips. The fish will slip through the holes. Finally, I resigned myself to the simple task of splitting the bark and vines, needed for weaving into the most perfectly even strands, which were much in demand. Emboldened by my success, I made a hammock. I cut strands about 7 feet long, tied the ends firmly together, reinforcing them with intertwined bark rope below the binding. I joined the light liana strands loosely with transverse cotton yarn, which I had dyed red with onoto. Ritimi was so enchanted with the hammock, she replaced Itua's old one with it. Itua, I made a new hammock for you, I said, as he came in from working in the garden. He looked at me skeptically. You think it will hold me? I clicked my tongue in affirmation, showing him how well I had reinforced the ends. Hesitantly, he sat in the hammock. It seems strong, he said, stretching fully. I heard the rubbing of the vine rope against the pole. But before I could warn him, Itua and the hammock were on the ground. Ritimi, Tutemi, Arasue, and his wives, watching from the hut next to us, burst into guffaws, immediately attracting a large crowd. Slapping each other on their thighs and shoulders, they doubled up with laughter. Later I asked Ritimi if she had tied the hammock loosely on purpose. Naturally, she said, her eyes shining with loving malice. She assured me that Itua was not in the least upset. Men enjoy being outwitted by a woman. Although I had my doubts as to whether Itua had actually enjoyed the incident, he certainly held no grudge against me. He advertised throughout the Shabono how well he was resting in his new hammock. I was besieged with requests. Sometimes I made as many as 3 hammocks a day. Several men busied themselves supplying me with cotton, which they separated by hand from the seeds. With a whorl stick, they spun the fibers into thread and twisted them into strong yarn, which I loosely wove in between the strands. With the finished hammock draped over my arm, I entered Iramamoe's hut one afternoon. Are you going to make arrows? I asked him. He had climbed up a pole in his hut and was reaching for canes stored under the rafters of the roof. Is this hammock for me? He asked, handing me the cane. He took the hammock, fastened it, then sat astride on it. It's well made. I made it for your eldest wife, I said. I'll make you one if you teach me how to make arrows. It isn't time to make arrows, Iramamoe said. I was only checking if the cane is still dry. He regarded me mockingly, then burst into laughter. The white girl wants to make arrows, he shouted at the top of his voice. I will teach her and take her hunting with me. Still laughing, he motioned me to sit beside him. He spread the cane on the ground, then sorted the shafts according to size. The long ones are best for hunting. Short ones are best for fishing and killing the enemy. Only a good marksman will use long ones for whatever he pleases. They are often flawed, and their trajectory is imprecise. Iramamoe selected a short and a long shaft. In here, I will fit the arrowhead, he said, splitting one end of each cane. Firmly he tied them together with cotton thread. He cut a few feathers in half, then attached them to the other end by means of resin and cotton thread. Some hunters decorate their shafts with their personal designs. I only do so when I go raiding. I like my enemy to know who killed him. Like most Ichikoteri men, Iramamoe was a superb raconteur, animating his stories with precise onomatopoeia, dramatic gestures, and pauses. Step by step, he took his listener through the hunt, how he first spotted the animal, how before releasing the arrow, he blew on it, the powdered roots of one of his magic plants to immobilize his victim, thus making sure his arrow would not fail to hit its target, and how, once hit, the animal resisted dying. With his eyes fixed on me, he emptied the contents of his quiver on the ground. In great detail, he explained about all the arrowheads he had. This is one of the palm wood points, he said, handing me a sharp piece of wood. It's made from splinters. The ring-like grooves cut into the point are smeared with mamukori. They break inside the animal's body. It's the best point for hunting monkeys. He smiled, then added, and for killing the enemy. Next, he held up a long, wide point, sharpened along its edges and decorated with meandering lines. This one is good for hunting jaguars and tapirs. The excited barking of dogs, mingled with the shouts of people, interrupted Iramamoe's explanation. I followed him as he rushed toward the river. An anteater the size of a small bear had taken refuge from the barking dogs in the water. Itua and Arasue had wounded the animal on the neck, stomach, and back. Raised on its hind legs, it pawed the air desperately with its powerful front claws. Want to finish it off with my arrow? Iramamoe asked. Unable to avert my gaze from the animal's long tongue, I shook my head. I was not sure whether he was serious or joking. The animal's tongue hung out of a narrow muzzle, dripping a sticky liquid in which dead ants swam. Iramamoe's arrow hit the anteater's tiny ear, and instantly the animal collapsed. The men tied ropes around the massive body, then hoisted it up the bank, where Arasue quartered the animal so the men could carry the heavy pieces to the Shabono. The men singed off the hair, then placed the various pieces on a wooden platform built over the fire. As soon as Hayama wrapped the innards in pishansi leaves, she buried them in the embers. An anteater, the children cried out, clapping their hands in delight. They danced around the fire. Wait until it's cooked properly, old Hayama warned the children. Whenever one poked at the tightly wrapped bundles, you will get sick if you eat meat that isn't well done. It has to cook until no more juice drips from the leaves. The liver was done first. Hayama cut me a piece before the children got to it. It was tender, juicy, and unpleasantly sour, as if it had been marinated in rancid lemon juice. Later, Iramamoe brought me a piece of the roasted hind leg. Why didn't you want to try my arrow? He asked. I might have hit one of the dogs, I said evasively, biting into the tough meat. It too tasted sour. I looked up into Iramamoe's face and wondered if he had been aware that I did not want to be even vaguely compared to Imawami, the woman shaman who knew how to call the hikuras and hunted like a man. On stormy afternoons, the men took a pina and chanted to the hikura of the anaconda to twist herself around the trees so as to prevent the wind from breaking their trunks. During one particularly vicious storm, old Kamasiwe rubbed white ashes over his wrinkled body. In a hoarse, raspy voice, he called out to the spider, his personal hikura, to spin her protective silvery threads around the plants in the gardens. Suddenly his voice changed to a higher pitch, as shrill as the piercing shriek of a parakeet. I was once an old child who climbed to the tallest treetop. I fell and was transformed into a spider. Why do you disturb my peaceful sleep? Reverting again to his old man's voice, Kamosiwe rose from his squatting position. Spider, I want to blow your sting on those hikuras who break and tear the plants in our gardens. With his epina cane, he blew all around the Shabono, aiming the spider sting against the destructive spirits. The following morning, I accompanied Kamasiwe into the gardens. Smiling, he pointed to the small hairy spiders, busily reweaving their webs. Minute drops of moisture clung to the tenuous, silvery threads. In the sunshine, they glistened like jade pearls, reflecting the greenness of leaves. We walked through the steaming forest toward the river. Squatting next to each other, we silently watched the broken lianas, trees, and masses of leaves speeding by in the muddy waters. Back in the Shabono, Kamosiwe invited me into his hut to share with him his specialty, roasted ants dipped in honey. A favorite pastime during these rainy nights was for a woman to ridicule her husband for a wrongdoing through a song. A quarrel ensued whenever the woman hinted that her man was better fit to carry a basket than a bow. These disputes always ended up as public arguments, in which others took an active part by expressing their own opinions. Sometimes hours after the quarrel had ended, someone would shout across the clearing with a fresh insight into the particular problem, thus renewing the squabble.